Hey, Lakeview Church, today is Thursday, September 24th, and your weekly devotional for this week comes from Joshua chapters 3 and 4. Now, where this takes place in the story of Israel in the Old Testament, Moses has led the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. They've crossed the wilderness. They've been wandering the desert for 40 years. They're on the edge of the promised land, and Moses died. So Joshua was appointed the new leader of Israel, and it was his task to take Israel into the promised land and take possession of this land that God had given them as an inheritance. At the beginning of the book of Joshua, as they come into the promised land, they face a barrier, the Jordan River. They don't know how they're going to cross it, but God said, take up the Ark of the Covenant and go stand in the water. So the priests pick up the Ark of the Covenant and they walk forward, and as they step foot into the edge of the river, God stopped up the flow of the river, and it all dried out in front of them, and the entire nation of Israel was able to walk across the Jordan River on dry ground. Kind of a similar miracle to what God did with Moses when they were coming out of Egypt, and they needed to cross the Red Sea, and God parted the Red Sea so they could cross on dry ground. Now, as they were crossing the river, Joshua selected 12 leaders, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and he said, I want you to pick up a large stone from the riverbed and carry it with you. And in Joshua chapter 4, verse 20, it says, Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. Now this happened at the beginning of their conquest of the Promised Land. This is before the Battle of Jericho. So they had enemies to defeat. They had battles to fight. They had victories to win. They had a long season of conquest ahead of them if they were going to take possession of this land that God had promised them. They had a lot further to go. But they stopped and remembered what God had done in their lives up to that point. I think this is a super interesting principle. We've been reading with our older boys a devotional called Love Does for Kids, written by an author named Bob Goff. By the way, he's got a Love Does devotional for adults as well. And I haven't read that one, but if it's as good as the one for kids, it's probably an excellent book. The Love Does for Kids devotional is great. And a few nights ago, we were reading in one of the chapters of Love Does for Kids. And he was telling a story about a little boy from Uganda that had been abused. And through the organizations and connections that Bob Goff had, he was able to rescue this boy out of an abusive family. And he talked to this young man and he said, what is it that you want to do? And the boy said, I want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, the tallest mountain in Africa. So Bob Goff said, this kid is like 10 years old. There's no way he can climb up Mount Kilimanjaro. But he said, let's do it. So they get some guides and they go to the mountain and they start climbing up the highest mountain in Africa, one of the tallest mountains in the world. And they don't make it to the top, but they made it a good way up. He said when they had gone as far as this 10-year-old boy could go, they stopped and they had a celebration. They had a party celebrating how far up the mountain he had come. And Bob Goff wrote this in the devotional. I thought this was really good. He said, before you point out how much farther someone needs to go, stop and celebrate how far they've come. He could have said, you know what? You didn't make it to the top of the mountain. You said you wanted to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, but you didn't get there. It's not what he did. Instead, he stopped and celebrated how far you've come. Look at the progress that you've made. When Joshua brought the Israelites across the Jordan River and God did that miracle for them, the first thing he said wasn't, all right, now we've got a whole series of battles and wars to fight. We've got a whole bunch of enemies to defeat. Don't start feeling too good about yourselves because there's a lot of work left to do. Nope. The first thing he said was, let's pick up some stones and build a memorial to God to celebrate how far God has brought us. Yes, we have a lot further to go, but God's not finished with us. God's brought us this far, He'll bring us the rest of the way. Sometimes it's easy to forget how far God has already brought us. And we need to stop and say, what was I like a year ago? What was I like 5 years ago? What was my life like 10 years ago? Wow, look at what God has done in me. Look at how God has changed me. Before I get mad at myself because I haven't quite made it far enough yet, let's stop and thank God for how far He's brought us. We can also apply that in how we deal with other people. And I think that's really the point that Bob Goff was getting at in the Devotional Love Does. Before you point out other people's failures, before you look at your spouse or your kids or a coworker or your boss and say, you know what, you didn't quite measure up. You didn't get that detail right. You didn't get those things correct. The parameters weren't set right on that machine. You didn't get this job done right. You didn't get that order right. Why is this not done well enough? Before we point out the flaws and the mistakes and how they didn't quite get far enough, we should stop and celebrate with them. Look at what you've done. Look at how far you've come. Look at the good things that God has done in your life. And we celebrate those things because God, who began a good work in us, will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. That's our theme for the year. I just want to leave you with that quote from Bob Goff one more time. Before you point out how much further someone needs to go, stop and celebrate how far they've come. That's our devotional for the week. God bless you.